I want to thank Dr. Barham for his hospitality once again. We missed very much the Sulaimani Forum during COVID and directly afterwards, so we're delighted that you are resuming, and you have the ability to bring together very prominent people from Iraq and outside the country. And so the audience is highly mixed, which is a great advantage to all of us. This panel, however, consists of people not from Iraq, and that is important as well, because that suggests that we are going to look from the outside in, rather than from the inside out. And so we have here a number of prominent people and analysts who will provide their thoughts about the situation in Iraq as seen from the outside and in the context of the region. As you know, the situation in the region and in the world is becoming extraordinarily dangerous at this stage. You saw the incident between the Russian plane and the American drone over the Black Sea. Interestingly, the situation in Iraq is relatively calm and stable, which is a great thing, but it could be deceptive, and I think we've already heard from Janine Plasgaard that there are still many things to be concerned about. So I want to first introduce the panelists. Next to me is Her Excellency Anna Linde from Sweden, who was foreign minister until 5 months ago. Now she is with us, but her government has changed rather significantly, but that means you can speak very freely, I hope. Next to her, we have Peter Bergen from the United States, from the New America Foundation, who will give us some analysis also, maybe from a somewhat American perspective, but of course there are many American perspectives. So again, feel free to go whichever way you want. His Excellency Nikolai Mladenov, whom many of you know because he was the head of UNAMI here in Iraq for some time and then became special coordinator for the Middle East peace process, which is the kind of a job that if you survive it politically, then you can take on just about anything in the world. Then we have Ra'ad al-Qadri. Ra'ad and I met in Baghdad in April 2003 for the first time. I never let go of him after that because he is one of the best analysts, if not the best analyst. I have to be careful because there are a couple of others in the audience who may kill me. Analyst on Iraq, and I'm so pleased to be able to be on this panel with him. And then we have Elena Suponina, whom I have also known for quite some time, and whose views I would look very much forward to. She is an advisor to the Russian International Affairs Council, with which we've had a strong relationship in the past, and we hope to continue it despite the very difficult circumstances that we face in the world right now involving Russia, Ukraine, and the West, and China. So without further ado, I want to ask Her Excellency Anne Linde to talk a little bit about the regional situation and especially her view of what the West, broadly speaking, the United States and Europe, how their position in the Middle East has shifted from where it was before, where there was a certain bond that was very active, to something that is, I guess, less than that. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I'm going to let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Jose, and thank you very much. I'm very happy to be invited. I'm so happy to see my friend, former President Barham Salih, and also Mr. Barzani, the president of the region, and my former colleague. We worked a lot together with difficult issues, so I'm so happy to be here. Well, anyway, I should talk a little about changing role of the international community when it comes to Iraq and the broader Middle East. And from the 2003, as we said, to present. And in just roughly 6 minutes, it's quite a big topic, but still, just to put out some thoughts. There has been so many changes since this period, and the invasion in 2003 by the United States and its allies, of course, made a significant turning point in the region. The intervention led to the ousting of Saddam Hussein, but also the subsequent establishment of a democratic government in Iraq. However, the US-led occupation was also met with resistance, leading to a long and protracted conflict that lasted over a decade. The situation in Iraq deteriorated rapidly, and that led to the rise of ISIS-Daesh and the subsequent international military intervention to combat the group. As a foreign minister, I took part in several meetings with the coalition against Daesh. It was an unusually big group that finally was what was needed to, together with the Kurdish forces in Syria and Iraq, push back Daesh. Of course, the Peshmerga forces has played an immense role, and I always want to underline that. Not the least now when, as many of you know, we have intense discussion with Turkey. It's important to underline how important the Kurdish forces has been in this when it comes to this. But the fact that tens of thousands of ISIS-Daesh prisoners and their families are still in detention in Syria and Iraq, and that they are guarded mainly by Kurdish forces. And when I visited Baghdad in 1.5 years ago, the forces, the NATO forces who were still there, said that this is like ISIS 2.0 that is growing in those camps. And still, this will actually mean that the relation between European and other countries who has people there will actually be very important. We took back about 40 women and children. I was very involved in that. It was extremely difficult. I had to send 8 missions with diplomats down, and we have difficult negotiation with the Kurdish authorities. It led to good result, but it was not easy, I have to say. And this is still in many of the European governments' head. And when we discuss it among foreign ministers, I feel that. The group of Al-Qaeda and ISIS-inspired groups is still a significant threat to the region and also to other countries, and that will form our relation. The Arab Spring, of course, in 2011 marked a significant turning point in MENA. Many of us believed that would be very good. I was myself sleeping in a tent in the Tahrir Square, and we believed so much in Tunisia. And now it's going in the wrong direction, even in Tunisia. And people are seeing this, okay, so democracy is not for this region. And I don't accept that. Of course, democracy, transparency, anti-corruption is for this region as well. But people think they see something else. I've been very engaged in Yemen, and I think still I'm the only EU foreign minister who has paid 2 full-day visits there. And the discussion between Saudi Arabia and Iran on this issue is, of course, something that is also very important for the region. I think that now what we have to say is that the recent years, the region has been overshadowed by other international development, such as the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but also now the terrible, unjust, illegal, against all humanitarian and international law invasion by Russia on the friendly neighboring country of Ukraine. That is the most and absolutely most important issue in the Western countries right now. It has destroyed the European Security Order, and I, as a president of the Organization for European Security and Cooperation in Europe for 2021, knows how much this has destroyed. I want to say a few words about the economic development, because the region, and as we heard, as Janine said, the corruption and bureaucracy is a great problem. And the fact is, and to be blunt, the region has little to offer than oil. And now, of course, China and India is buying a lot of oil, but United States is not buying any oil anymore. And Europe is getting the green transition very, very rapidly. So where will you be in 30 years if you don't diversify? If you don't diversify, the situation in 20, 30 years will look very grim. I'm sorry to say, but I think so. One country that has seen that is Saudi Arabia. They have their Vision 2030, and they have started to have a lot of solar energy and changes. They have a lot of changes when it comes to social and civil liberties, unfortunately not when it comes to human and civil rights. The Saudi Public Investment Fund also established its funds channeling 24 billion toward Egypt, Oman, Iraq, Jordan, Sudan, and Bahrain. And that is the clearest indication how they will use their soft power in the region. And now we see how China has used their interest in being the country that has broke the diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran. We may see a shift in US and Europe priorities. The US has historically been involved in the union, in the region, but now the Biden administration has said, well, we don't need their oil anymore, and we need to focus on the main issue for us, Taiwan and China. And we can see this shift. And I think Europe has to take up a greater responsibility for the contacts when US is going back. So in conclusion, the role of the international community in Iraq and the broader MENA region has evolved significantly over the past 2 decades. While the region may no longer be the focus of attention that it once was, it remains strategically important for a number of reasons. The next chapter of international engagement is likely to focus on counterterrorism, economic development, and multilateral cooperation, and there might be a shift between US and EU involvement. But we must work together to address these challenges, and I think that we should have much greater cooperation between the EU countries and the region. Thank you.
Thank you. Indeed. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I may come back to you later with a question about the green transition and what it actually means for relations between Europe and countries like Iraq. But I need to give others on the panel a chance, and I want to move to His Excellency Nikolai Mladenov. I don't have a specific question for you because you've played, of course, you were Prime Minister of Bulgaria, Foreign Minister. Well, you've have played a major role in the United Nations. You've seen the world, as I said earlier, Israel, Palestine. So from your perspective, looking at the region, what do you think we can do as international community? And this, I take this term very loosely because the international community is loose. What can we do to bring down the temperature and to find a better way forward?
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that question. And let me first pay tribute to President Barham Saleh for bringing us together again after COVID. And I do hope that everyone in this room realizes that something quite unique is happening today. Something really unique is happening in this forum right at this moment. We have the President of the Kurdistan region and the Prime Minister of Iraq talking about something that President Barham was a lonely voice for many years on, and that is Iraq's climate change challenges. And they speak with passion of the need for this country to come together with its diversity, with its youth, with its resources to tackle the problems of the future. This is a unique moment, I think, for all of us who have been involved with Iraq's transition since 2003. And the fact that today we hear good news, we discuss good news, budgets, new ideas, new initiatives, is really a turning point in the history of this country. And I do hope that the international community will realize that its responsibility from now going forward is to support Iraq, to support the leaders of Iraq in resolving their own problems, not solving their problems for them. Because this is where things change. Iraq for many years has gotten too used to foreigners, and with all due respect, I've been one of them in my role as UNAMI and America and others, mediating and solving problems. Now I think Iraq has the unique opportunity to work on its own. Because what we see today is a determination by the Prime Minister, by the leadership of the country, to really tackle the challenges of the day. And we see a regional environment which actually has called on everyone in the Middle East no longer to rely on the outside world as much as they have relied in the past, to make sure that the countries in the region have their own capabilities and their own capacities, their own skilled labor force, their skilled intellectual capacity to really work on their own security, their policies, and their leadership. And I think this change is really the change that everybody was looking for when Saddam Hussein was ousted out of power. We were all, in fact, in that long, many years ago, in 2003, hoping for democracy in Iraq, but really hoping for an Iraq and for a region that is actually less reliant on the world and more focused on working forward on its own problems. And today, I think after many of the discussions that we heard this morning, the fact that the Prime Minister recognizes Iraq's diversity and talks about, and both the President and the Prime Minister talk about the resources that the country has beyond oil, is really something that needs to be recognized by the world. The region is changing. The United States is here to stay, but also others are coming. China, other forces, other countries will have an increasing interest in this part of the world. And if Iraq doesn't have the institutions, the leadership, the knowledge, and I really believe that it can, to handle these relationships, it will continue to be the subject of outside interference more than the generator of peace and security for the rest of the region. And let me close by saying that I think what I was most inspired by this morning's presentations was one other thing. You know, this country has relied for too long on oil, and the money that oil makes to make sure that the revenue is distributed, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, to the people. But what it really needs to rely on is a capital that it hasn't tapped on until now, and that is the vast potential of the Iraqi people. Iraq's growing population, its growing youth population, deserves that the oil revenues that the country makes are used to make sure that people get the best education, the best healthcare, the best opportunities to develop an economy that is not reliant on hydrocarbons, but is reliant on innovation in the future. And with the historical and the cultural diversity this country has, with the traditions that it has in crafts, in arts, in innovation, it can be that leader. And this is where the region is going. I'm quite positive about where Iraq is now, and I really see the opportunities going forward for the country and for the rest of the Middle East.
Thank you so much for that intervention. I think what I'm hearing now is from both speakers so far is that you can look at the situation in Iraq within the context of the wider region as the glass half full. Things are going well in some ways. There are good steps being taken. There's a certain pragmatism. There's a focus on really concrete issues. At the same time, the glass is also half empty. There is corruption, fasad, gandali. And that is causing a lot of harm, and it's also keeping outside investors away because they do not trust the investment climate, understandably. So I want to turn to Ra'ad next. And I have to apologize because earlier I said this is a panel of not of Iraqis, but of course Ra'ad is an Iraqi. But he likes to identify himself as British. But I think at this time, isn't it better to be an Iraqi, given the state of Britain? I mean, your choice, your choice. In any case, why don't, I know you don't want to be in a position where you tell us how the glass is half empty, but you would acknowledge that there is a way to look at it that way. Can you tell us a little bit about sort of the deeper challenges that Iraq faces, both internally and within the international context, the Green Revolution, everything else?
Excellencies, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Joost, for setting me up like that. As someone who is renowned for seeing the glass as half empty, I get to play to my character. Look, I think if you look at it, and I agree with everything that's been said, but I think if you look at it, geopolitics has not been a kind mistress to Iraq over the past 20 years. And part of that has been external, as the country came out of the 2003 experience, as it came out of the experience that preceded that. It was weak, it lacked capacity, its institutions were largely destroyed, and it therefore was an easy playground for regional powers and international powers that had their own agendas and felt that Iraq should be shaped along the lines of those agendas. Iraq has consistently been the place of proxy wars. And I think that has shaped the experience, that has held back Iraq's ability to progress, Iraq's ability to take advantage of all of the resources that it is blessed with. And as we move forwards, that becomes one of the critical questions. Now, you can say that Iraqis have sought outsiders to solve their problems, and that's something I'll get to. But I think outsiders have also sought to take advantage of what is a country that is in a strategic location and have, as all countries do, been very selfish and closed-minded in how that drives things. And that has undermined stability in Iraq and undermined progress in Iraq. The bit where I think I come as glass half empty is I've been dealing with this for decades, and the number of leaders who have come to power and have made promises and not fulfilled those promises for a variety of domestic reasons are legion. And, you know, Iraq has lacked visionaries. I will pay homage to Dr. Barham in the sense that both in public and in private, he has been somebody who has had a strategic vision for the country that goes beyond parochial and patronage politics. But the reality is, he is few and far between in terms of Iraqi leaders. And Iraqi leaders have allowed themselves to be manipulated. In terms of putting their own agendas first, they have sought international backing. That means that it isn't a country that has international and foreign relations, but it has foreign dependencies, and it is based on opportunism. So that's the challenge for the government. It starts domestically. It starts internally. The problems and the divisions are very clear, but they aren't easy to solve, and it also requires time, and time ticks away. You know, we talk about this being the 20th anniversary of the removal of Saddam. That means that Iraq's leaders have been in power for 20 years. That is not a short period of time. And therefore, you can't constantly look to the past. Eventually, you know, there has to be accountability for the present and the future. And I think that, from an international relations standpoint, is very important. Iraq will continue to be a place of proxy wars. It will continue to be a place of internal division if Iraqi leaders allow themselves to do the bidding of external forces as opposed to putting Iraqi sovereignty and interests first.
Wonderful. Thank you, Raad. It's a good warning. It chimes with what Janine said earlier, and it's bracing. I mean, we have to understand the challenges, but you've laid them out in such a way that we know what the way forward could be, if only we had more visionaries and strategic vision and the right people stepping forward into the positions of decision making. So thank you for that. I'm now going to Elena Soponina and ask her again within the international context, since you are from Russia, you will have your own views, how you see the situation developing in the region as a result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what it means for Iraq in particular, but also more broadly for Russian foreign policy in the region, and anything else you might have prepared.
Thank you, Just. Thank you for all of us. Maybe I will be the first, but I hope not the last in these panels who will speak in Arabic. So I will speak in Arabic, please, if you need the translation. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. شكرا جزيلا على هذه الدعوة. أنا لست لأول مرة أشارك في هذا المؤتمر، ودائما ألاحظ أن التنظيم رائع، وأريد أن أشكر مرة أخرى على هذا الشيء. ما أكثرية الكتاب والشعار في روسيا كتبوا أكثر من مرة، ومنهم بوشكين وتولستوي وتوتشيف ودوستويفسكي وحتى تشيخوف، رغم أنه ممل بعض الأحيان، أن الحياة في فترة الاستقرار هي فترة غير ممتعة. أما من يعيش فترة التقلبات فهو لازم أن يكون سعيد جدا، وهذا ينطبق على مثل صيني شهير أنه من أتى إلى هذه الدنيا في فترة التقلبات هو شخص سعيد جدا. فأنا أهنئكم على المجيء إلى هذه الدنيا في فترة التقلبات، خاصة أن العراق لديها تجربة أكثر من 20 سنة مع هذه السعادة، ولكننا نحن في روسيا نرى بأن الحمد لله دولة العراق الآن تمشي في طريق نحو الاستقرار الأكثر وتعزيز مؤسسات الدولة، وأيضا دورها الإقليمي والدولي الآن يزيد، وهذا تطبيقا لمبادرة بغداد. ونرى دور العراق التوسطي في كثير من الأزمات في هذا الإقليم، وروسيا ترحب بهذا الشيء. وطبعا منذ أكثر من 20 سنة بعض الدول وبعض المؤسسات وقت كتبت أن العراق ممكن أن تقسم إلى 3 دويلات، روسيا انتقدت هذا الشيء بشدة، لأن روسيا تعتقد أن الفيدرالية هو أحسن الحل لكثير من الدول بما فيها روسيا نفسها. والآن نحن نتابع بأن نفس المؤسسات بعض الأحيان في الغرب تنشر بأن الفيدرالية في روسيا هي ليست جيدة، وعلى هذه الدولة أن تتقسم مثل ما تقسم الاتحاد السوفيتي السابق. صدقوني هذا الشيء لن يحدث، ومن يكتب ويقترح هذا الشيء هو يمكن يخطئ في فهمه لطبيعة الشخص الروسي، لأنه مثل ما هو الشخص العراقي هذا الكلام بالعكس يثير حفيظة مواطني روسيا ويساعد على التفاف الناس حول الكرملين وحول رئيس بوتين، وهذا لابد من هذا الشيء. فبالنسبة لروسيا هذا الصراع الآن هو الصراع الوجودي. فما هو دور الشرق الأوسط في هذا الشيء والعلاقة ما بين روسيا والشرق الأوسط في كل هذه المعادلات والتقلبات؟ أنا أكثر من مرة في زماني التقيت برئيس الوزراء الروسي السابق سيد يفغيني بريماكوف المرحوم، وفكرته الأساسية كانت، وهو بالذات أنا أعرف هذا بشكل جيد، طرح فكرة تعدد الأقطاب. فروسيا تؤمن بأن تعدد الأقطاب هذا الأمر لابد منه، فالشرق الأوسط هو لا شك يمثل القطب المهم في هذه المعادلة المستقبلية. فدور الشرق الأوسط أولاً في بناء العالم الجديد بتعزيز أدوار دول وأقاليم بشكل جديد وبعدالة أكثر، وهذا ما كتبته الدراسة المهمة حوالي 5 صفحات لوزارة الخارجية الصينية تم نشرها في نهاية فبراير. هم قالوا وانتقدوا بشدة سياسة الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية في هذه المنطقة وغيرها، وقالوا أن السعي للعالم بتعدد الأقطاب لابد منه. الدور الثاني للشرق الأوسط كما نراه في موسكو نراه الآن هو الدور التوسطي. سابقاً روسيا وهي ما زالت تلعب الدور التوسطي مثلا في تطبيع العلاقات ما بين سوريا ورئيس أسد اليوم موجود في موسكو وتركيا، ما بين سوريا وتركيا وإيران في إطار التعاون الثلاثي. ولكن ما نراه وما نرحب به أن دول الشرق الأوسط أيضا بدأت أن تلعب دورا توسطيا، مثلا تركيا، المملكة العربية السعودية، الإمارات، كل هذه الدول لعبت دورا مهما في الأشهر الأخيرة في موضوع تبادل الأسرى بين روسيا وأوكرانيا، في موضوع تبادل السجناء ما بين روسيا وأمريكا. وحسب معلوماتي هذا الدور هو مستمر، ولا بد من صفقة جديدة ما بين روسيا وأوكرانيا حول الأسرى، وما بين روسيا وأمريكا حول تبادل السجناء. روسيا دائما كانت تسعى وما زالت لبناء توازنات في منطقة الشرق الأوسط. موسكو لا تسعى لبناء تحالف ضد تحالف آخر، فهذا صعب جدا، لأنه يمكن أسهل أن يشكل واحد تحالف ضد تحالف وأن يؤجج أزمات المنطقة لكي يستفيد مثل ما نقول فرق وتسد. لا، روسيا سياستها غير، ولكن هذا في غاية الصعوبة، الحفاظ على العلاقة المتوازنة مع كل من تركيا ودول عربية، إسرائيل وإيران. أنا برأيي هذا الدور سيستمر، فهذا هو الدور الثالث لهذا الشيء. وأخيراً الدور الرابع، مثل ما كتبت الآن شركة البحوث راند كوربوريشن، الشرق الأوسط هي منطقة وحيدة في العالم ممكن أن نلاقي فيها نقاط التماس ما بين روسيا ودول الغرب، وحتى ما بين روسيا والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية. أنا أؤمن أنه في نهاية المطاف لابد من إجراء المفاوضات حتى حول موضوع أوكرانيا وعلى التفاهمات العامة على المسرح الدولي. فدور الشرق الأوسط هون مهم للغاية. شكرا جزيلا.
شكرا لك. I'm very happy you spoke in a sort of nice Fusha and not in Iraqi accent, because I would not have been able to follow you, I think. That's no comment on the Iraqi language. But the last speaker on the panel, I would like to give the word to Peter Bergen. The United States as a player has come up repeatedly in the last few presentations, but in a sort of superficial way only. And I was wondering if you could give some depth to what the United States is doing in the region. And you can go back and not limit yourself to Iraq, but of course it would be good to look at it, especially in the context of the intervention in Iraq in 2003 and what happened afterward, and what that means for the United States in the region more broadly, given everything else that is going on. And this only in 5 or 6 minutes.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Barham, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here. I feel like a total imposter because I'm neither a former government official or a current one, and I'm certainly not an expert on Iraq. However, I basically want to make 3 points. One is about U.S. engagement. The United States has 2,500 troops in Iraq, which you might say, look, that's a very small number. But interestingly, that's exactly the same number of troops the United States had in Afghanistan. And we all know what happened after those troops were pulled out. Now, I'm not saying Afghanistan's Iraq or anything close to that, But what I am saying is that those 2,500 American troops are very significant for the United States' long-term engagement in Iraq. If there are no troops, I think there will be no American engagement. And let's look at 2024. Let's do the thought experiment where President Donald Trump says, hey, let's take these troops out. Or let's do the thought experiment where some other president, President DeSantis, says the same thing. And think about the effects I think that would have on the region. And we've already run this videotape once before. President Obama, as you know, he took all American troops out of Iraq in 2011, and look what followed. We still have, by the way, 900 American troops in the United States, still has 900 American troops in Syria. I think these troop presences are very important, and you're about to hear from Lieutenant General Terry Wolfe in conversation with Amina al-Arabi. Lieutenant General Wolfe was instrumental in the US-led campaign against ISIS. Obviously, it was an Iraqi campaign on the ground. But I think he would agree that maintaining these troop presences are very important politically in the United States and I think for the region. The second point is I would say that the United States has done very little self-examination about the Iraq war on the following level. We all know that what happened after the US invasion, so I'm not going to detain you with any of that. But I think the Iraq war was conducted under, I think it would be sort of generous to say, false assumptions, certainly faulty intelligence. And if you look at polling data before, months before the Iraq war in the United States, 2/3 of Americans believe that Saddam Hussein was personally involved in 9/11, despite the fact there was no evidence for that. Okay, fast forward now to the war in Ukraine. Putin has made this, false claims about Ukraine being not an independent country, not a real country. Many Russians believe they're fighting neo-Nazis. Of course, Putin's war in Ukraine is very different from the conduct of the US war in Iraq. But I would say there's been very little self-examination in the United States about this issue. And just earlier this month, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in India at a conference there said, basically he called out an American double standard on this. And while I'm obviously, as an American citizen, there are many, many differences, but I would say there's not a lot of self-examination on this issue of wars that are conducted without UN security backing very few allies and under false assumptions. And finally, on the role of China, if I'm a historian writing in the 22nd century, I would look back to 2023 as the moment when the British and the French controlled the region after World War I. The Americans controlled it. By control, I'm using the word sort of in a kind of metaphorical sense, was the regional hegemon after World War II. And up until now, the kind of general kind of cliche about China is that they just wanted to do, have economic investments in the region and Belt and Road and these kinds of things. And now, of course, they've intervened in, I think, the most important potentially diplomatic breakthrough for a long time. I think this makes the Abraham Accords look like a very minor issue, if indeed it plays out in the way the foreign minister mentioned Yemen. I mean, we could see a hot war in Yemen, which is already sort of cooling down, become really some form of ceasefire that is sustaining. We could see the kind of proxy warfare that has played out to some degree in Iraq subsiding. We could see the Cold War that has played out in Lebanon also subsiding, if indeed this diplomatic breakthrough brokered by the Chinese holds. So I think from an American's perspective, this should also take some self-reflection.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm going to open the floor to questions. Some questions have already started to come in. I'll turn to them in a second. I want to first ask one question that any of you on the panel can answer, all of you if you want, but you only get 1 minute each. And it's the kind of question that deserves a little bit more than 1 minute. I already mentioned that when it comes to the international community, there is very little interest in investing in Iraq as long as the corruption is so bad and the institutions are weak and everything else. So so in a way, it doesn't want to do more than it's already doing. It would like things to keep moderately stable so that things don't fall apart. External intervention doesn't become completely destabilizing. On the other hand, it also seems that, and this may be counterintuitive, and a little bit ironic, but since 2011, the region has become in bad shape because of the civil wars that have broken out in Yemen, Libya, Syria. We have high tensions, Israel-Palestine at the moment with the new Israeli government. Iran, the United States, is, without a nuclear deal, is not in a good state. So, but Iraq actually, by comparison, looks pretty calm. And that is, again, as a bit counterintuitive. So that also means that for the international community, again, such as it is, it's sort of, what you can't see, you won't need to act on. So what is it really that you think that your country and your countries and the institutions we've created for the international order can and should do concretely for Iraq in the coming period to pull it into a better direction, working with Iraqi leaders, of course? Who wants to go first? You would like? Yes, please.
Well, thank you very much. I think to get the interest from other countries, you need to be part of the solution. And one of the big challenges now is the green transition. That's what we are working with all the time, because it's both for the climate but also for economic reason. And there needs to be a view that Iraq or other Middle East countries is part of the solution. And right now there is not a view on that. And I think that is one of the big challenges. And I saw when I read up for this panel that if you take the whole MENA region, from Mauritania to Afghanistan, 600 million people, 97% of all the innovation the last year has come from Israel. 97%. There need to be, with all those, with the university, with the people, with the sources, there ought to be much more coming from these countries because the potential is there, but it's not used. And maybe that is also because there is not any intention or incentive to make the change, because the change would also cost.
Thank you, that was beautiful. Nikolai and then Raad.
Very briefly, I think there should be two focuses. One, obviously, is institutions. No country can function without strong institutions that have buy-in from the population and that are built on rules that are observed by everyone. And in this sense, I think going back to the Constitution, to the parts of the Constitution that have not been implemented, to really revamping large parts of the legislative base of Iraq, which in many cases still relies on legislation from Saddam Hussein's time, is an important task. And I think this is where the international community can help. But secondly, also I think we, from the outside, need to recognize that we haven't always cracked the code of how to communicate with Iraqis. We have to recognize that we're dealing with an extremely traumatized society that has been traumatized for generations by all kinds of outside interventions and forces, and that society has its own mechanisms of reaching consensus and mechanisms of reaching agreement that we need to respect and to work with.
Thank you very much. Raad and then Helen.
One of the joys of having multiple identities is you get to be schizophrenic, so I'll give you a schizophrenic answer on this. Look, I've followed, obviously, the oil industry in Iraq very closely, and I think one of the things that Iraq is going to have to do, if you take the example of the oil industry, which, let's face it, had companies lining up to throw tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars into the country, and was seen as the most exciting thing of the sort of 2000s, certainly, and into the 2010s, is Iraq's going to have to restore its reputation. Because what it did with the oil companies and what it did with the oil investment was dangle promise and subsequently failed to be a capable partner in the investment environment. And that was simple things like capacity to be able to negotiate, capacity to be able to implement, be able to follow up on strategic plans, develop infrastructure. Oh, and that little thing, pay your bills, which oil companies tend to find being rather important. And that wasn't happening. So as I look at it from an outside perspective, what investors want is confidence that they will get return on their investments. The essence of that is predictability and rule of law. And as long as you have gross corruption, and as long as you don't have strong institutions, that isn't going to happen. Now I'll put my schizophrenic hat on and say, energy transitions and climate looks very different from Europe and the United States than it does here. And if you want a conversation with Iraq about energy transitions and climate, have it on Iraqi terms. Quite frankly, there are two parts of the energy transitions debate. There is climate mitigation and climate adaptation. The West is obsessed with climate mitigation, reducing emissions. And it can do that because it's reached an economic stage where it can start to make compromises and has an industrial base where energy transitions actually is to industrial benefit. What Europe is doing, what the United States is doing, is using green transitions as the basis for a protectionist industrial system. So actually coming and lecturing the world in terms of energy transitions doesn't work. What matters here, and there are two gentlemen in this audience sitting in front of me who've said this openly, is climate adaptation. This country's problem is not emissions per se. It produces less than 0.5% of the emissions of the world. It is how you address the impact of climate and how you get international support to help you address that impact. And as long as we have the debate right now, which is essentially either have hydrocarbons or don't have hydrocarbons, good and bad energy, good and bad policy, you get nowhere. What you need is an understanding that energy transitions means very different things to very different countries based on their economic development, based on their political development, and based on what hits them. Drying up rivers, salination, fisheries going out, agriculture being impacted, urban migration. Those are the issues you have to address here, and quite frankly, solar and wind don't address those issues. That can come later, but deal with the issues that matter most to Iraq.
Indeed. Very sobering reminder of how we need to always communicate better about our respective interests and abilities. So really thank you for that, Raad. I know, Elena, you wanted to come in as well on the question.
Yes, thank you. Russia strongly believes that it's not international order without the stability in this region. In 2014, Russia provided maybe not so big, but very quick and needed help to Baghdad when it was needed against Daesh. And this kind of cooperation is still developing now, and Russia supports strongly Baghdad initiative and all efforts of Iraq as a mediator in this region, as Russia strongly supports now the efforts of China towards Saudi Arabia and Iran. Moscow also understands that it's no way for any military solution to any crisis here in this region, as also Russia supports the returning of Syria to the Arab League as a normal member of an active member of this organization. And Russia is working hard now to improve relationship between Turkey and Syria, and I'm sure that there is also at the interest of Iraq as a state of this region, all efforts of Iraqi state in this issue also supported very strongly by Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Okay, so questions from the audience. We have exactly 8 minutes left, maybe give or take a couple. So I'll go trying to stay within the overall theme, as it was a question which I think has been addressed, if not answered, which is almost impossible, but, and it was for you, Ms. Linde, is do you think Iraq is ready for the green transition and circular economy? But after what we heard from Ra'ad al-Qadiri, the question may be, does Sweden understand well what the Iraqi needs are, and is it adapting or tailoring its policies when it comes to the green transition to the situation in countries like Iraq? And you don't have to limit yourself to Iraq. You've dealt with many in your position as foreign minister. Do you have a view on that?
Well, the fact is that we think, even if I listen with interest to what you said, that we need to get into a fossil-free energy mix, and we need to phase out sooner rather than later coal and oil and gas. And of course that is difficult for a country that is dependent on oil. But I think that right now, as I said, United States no longer buys any oil. They are by far the biggest producer of oil and gas. Who could believe that just 20 years ago? And it's China and India who is now main buyer of the oil. But it's also an ending resources. It will not be there for if you look, as I said, with the perspective of 30 years. And 30 years, now we're talking 20 years in 2003. And many of us feels like 2003 was a few years ago. I mean, it's much quicker than you think. And what I said is that some countries have started the transition and some countries has not. And I think the future is dependent on a transition. I was in South Africa in December, and we talked a lot about these changes, and they have enormous problem with energy shortage, enormous problems. And they will try to make a transition. At the same time, they said, but we need to go back to coal. And then there will not be these possibility to help them economically or with innovation or with investments, because the rest of the Western world that have a lot of investment in South Africa now will not go for that, will not go for that solution. So it's a short-sighted solution to only rely on the fossil energy. You need to see it in the longer term.
That's an issue, of course, that has come up in the case of Europe as well, because it found itself very vulnerable after the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
We changed faster than anybody thought was possible. Look at Germany.
You had a mild winter to help you, fortunately. So there was an adaptation that was actually remarkable. But last year there was a real concern that there would be a real shortage, and that Europe would have to go to the spot market at much higher prices and buy up gas, which would immediately drive the price up further and make it very difficult for poorer countries to purchase their gas. And of course that affects then their position on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So everything is linked. And so we all have to have foresight in a way and not become overly dependent and diversify early on. And I think as part of the green transition, we really need to find a way to manage the period between where we are now, which is heavy dependence on hydrocarbons, and the situation where we want to be, which is net zero. That's going to be a very difficult transition. Anyway, I'm talking too much. I got a lovely question here from Omar Sheikh Mouz. Hello, good to see you again. In the case of regime change in Iran, his question, not mine, because I don't predict it. What are the potential consequences in Iraq? Well, does anyone want to tackle that? Yes, Ra'ad. I knew you would be ready for that.
Regime change, as this country has demonstrated over the past 20 years, sounds really good on paper. It's really messy in reality. And I think when you start to look at what the impact of regime change in Iran will be on Iraq, That's a question about what regime change looks like in Iran and whether you think you are going to move to a more stable system, irrespective of its nature, whether you think it is going to be a system that can consolidate itself, that has backing, and that fundamentally is going to bring something more benign and more stable than you have right now. I think those are huge questions. And I think those who see somehow, and again, it tends to be an outsider view, not an insider view, that regime change in Iran suddenly transforms the Middle East and transforms Iraq, haven't really been reading their history of late.
Peter, please.
There are a couple of points to make. One, why would a new Iranian regime be less interested in nuclear weapons? And that's sort of a false assumption. And two, Thomas Hobbes wrote Leviathan in 1651 at the end of the English Civil War. And the basic point of Leviathan, there's only one thing worse than a despot. It's civil war and anarchy. And we've seen that play. And Americans make the same type of decision, doesn't matter which administration. Obama made the same decision in Libya, in a sense, that George W. Bush made in Iraq. And this is a bipartisan failure to basically not envision what will come next, which is not an apology for authoritarian dictators, but it is a kind of a plea to, let's learn from our history.
Yeah, thank you. There also is the question, of course, of how does regime change happen? It's a sort of a fuzzy term. It can be top-down, can be bottom-up. That would affect how it will look afterward. So, and you could also ask the question, it's a real dilemma. You say, well, regime change creates chaos and violence and uncertainty, no investment, everything else, a very difficult transition, as maybe we have seen to a great extent here. On the other hand, is the current situation acceptable? Is it when there are paramilitaries that are not directly answerable to the state? Ideally, I think Iraq would like to have a state that can have control over all various actors, especially security ones. Anyway, I forgot to recognize earlier that the question about the green transition was from Paima Ahmed. Thank you for that. And finally, there is a question from Dr. Ali Sabah. He asks, how does the international community evaluate the Iraqi situation in view of a government they were afraid to cooperate with, keeping in mind that this government is a product of the 20 years of foreign policy influence since 2003. In other words, this government is the outcome of a foreign intervention, indirectly, but of course, it's been consistent trajectory for the last 20 years. Why is the international community hesitant now to interact with it? I'm not sure that's the premise is correct, but if anyone wants to address it, yes, please, Nicola.
Well, first of all, let me begin by saying that for the 20 years since the end of Saddam's regime, Iraq, with all the faults of all of its legislation and election laws and sectarian politics, with all that in mind, has been able to switch governments consistently in a peaceful manner. And all, forgive me for saying it, former presidents and prime ministers are alive, and many of them are sitting in this room, and that is a very, very serious achievement. And yes, transition is messy, but transition from a society which has relied on the decision of one man and his ability to wield life and death on everybody, to a society in which political parties emerge, institutions develop, people vote, again, with all the problems that has been in the past. In a peaceful manner, I think is quite an important success. Of course, that doesn't mean that the challenges, that the system doesn't need to be upgraded and updated consistently in order to reflect what people need and to make it more functional. It is, for me personally, it is embarrassing, if I can use that word, to think that a country as rich as Iraq has the difference of living standards that exist between the people in Basra, in Tikar, in Baghdad, in Erbil, in Sulaimani, in Ramadi, and in Mosul, and across the whole country. There's no excuse for any government not to focus on building up the infrastructure, the roads, the universities, the education system, the healthcare system, and everything. There's enough money for that. And I think where where the problem has been is that with all the focus on the democracy and transition and power, we lost a little bit of the focus of the need to really build institutions in Iraq that sustain the state. And that is a focus that we need to return to very soon in order to make what is already a good base into a real success for the country. Forget the region. I'm not talking about the region. I'm just talking about this country because of the responsibility that its leaders have to its own welfare.
And this is the second time you've mentioned the importance of institutions. I think it's very true. And I remember talking with Ra'ad and Toby Dodge, who's in the audience, in 2003 about the hole in the heart of Iraq. There were no institutions that could uphold a new order, and they needed to be rebuilt. But that process is, of course, of long term, is very difficult, and we're still in the process of, I'm not, but in the process of doing so.
But who is responsible for this hole? This is also important question.
Responsible for what?
For this hole, for the creation of this instability. This is also an important question. There are some countries that are responsible for this, but they do nothing, maybe, or they do not enough to solve all these problems created because of their policies.
This is a longer discussion about the origins and the original sins of the American invasion. We could have a long argument and we would agree on many things, maybe disagree on some. In any case, point well taken. Also, I should say that as a researcher for Human Rights Watch, I know what the previous regime did. I mean, every Iraqi knows what the previous regime did, but as an outsider, I certainly was researching the Anfal campaign in 1988. So if you ask me what is better before or after 2003, I have my answer. But, and please.
Well, thank you. I just reacted to the wording of the question. Why is governments hesitant to cooperate with the Iraqi government? And I would say that that is not the case. Other government is not hesitant to cooperate with Iraqi government. And as I just said, I and my counterpart have had many discussions on very, very difficult issues. But the fact that it's relatively peaceful now, and there has been a transition. There is a prime minister in place. There is the question of ISIS is a little bit on hold. That means that this make the urgency of having very close relation not the same as when there is the conflict. And then you have to see on what issues should we cooperate. We should cooperate on multilateralism. We should cooperate on development when it comes to the issues that is the most pressing, and that is now green transition and climate. And maybe in a way that you say we need to do it, but that's the fact. It's on the top of the agenda. I mean, listen to Guterres. He cannot say a word without mentioning it. And it's economic development. And to get the economic development, everybody has said it, you need to get rid of the corruption, of course, but you also need to get the issue of stable order and rule base better. And I've heard some, and you will hear later, some witnesses of how difficult it is to get permits, to get the possibility to have your company in Suli, if you already are in Erbil, for example. You need to get rid of that if you want to have more economic possibilities and cooperation. And I think people really, really need that. So it's not hesitation. It's just interest, common interest. And we need, if we don't have it, we need to create it.
So I'm being told to wrap it up, Raad. I'm very sorry. We'll have to talk over tea later. Your Excellencies, thank you for listening. I thought it was an engaging conversation. It's a much longer one, obviously. I want to thank you all, the panelists, for joining us here today, and all of you for listening. And the conversations will, I'm sure, continue in the hallway. So thank you again, and enjoy the rest of the conference.